What does it take to create something that has never existed before? What does it take to challenge the status quo? What does it take to change the world? This is the Swell Podcast. Take a journey with us as we seek the answers to those questions through the stories of thought leaders, world builders, game changers, disruptors, and other pleasantly rebellious humans who set out to do something novel, creative, or disruptive. This episode of the Swell Pod is brought to you in partnership with Kiln. Kiln provides flex office space for teams and individuals. Their all-inclusive set of amenities helps startups, creatives, and entrepreneurs alike get work done. Learn more about Kiln at kiln.co. Thank you. Welcome to the Swell Podcast, everybody. So today we have Aga Bajer. We're super excited to be chatting with Aga today. It's going to be a great conversation. Just going to go over a quick bio for you, and then we'll kind of dive into this. But so Aga is a culture strategist, the founder of CultureBrained, the author of Building and Sustaining a Coaching Culture, and the creator and host of the CultureLab Podcast. The question at the core of her work is, how can we make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging so that great companies are able to make the right dent in the world? Aga, she grew up in Poland for the past 20 years. She's been helping companies pay attention to their culture in a way that produces desirable results. From VC courting startups to Fortune 500, Aga has worked on cultivating remarkable cultures that scale and that help people do the best work of their careers. First as part of consultancies such as HayGroup, Korn Ferry, and PwC, and then later the founder of her own firm. Her true passion today is helping clients codify, activate, and evolve their culture playbooks so that they can create an environment where the right culture emerges naturally by choice and not by chance. So we're super excited to speak with you. In relationship to, I know Spencer and I, we both have experience building stories, designing experiences for cultures. And, for me specifically, I love storytelling, and I'm super excited to talk to you about story and its impact on culture. And I know Spencer has a lot of things that he's excited to talk to you about as well today too.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And before we get into kind of the first set of questions, I just want to say, over time, your podcast has really made a big impact. I was kind of listening to one episode now and again, here and there, but then now it's like something. Lots of the early ones, like Seth Godin, really caught my eye. But over time now, I've listened to, I would say, 70% of your episodes. I think it's fantastic. Wow. I think they're specific. I listen to them just like my brothers, Greg, who might come on your podcast as well. I've listened to it really but I have to listen to it every week. I think it gives me great ideas. I've read books because of your podcast and implemented certain things in our work because of conversations you've had in the podcast. And so thank you for the work you do. One of the first questions I want to kick off with is what to you is a remarkable culture?
Well, I think that I would have answered probably something slightly differently a few years ago. So it's such a great question, I think, to ask at this stage, because actually, at some point in my career, I was really keen on this idea that there is no one size fits all, and that obviously we all know that every company is different and unique in its own way. And so it would only make sense that a remarkable culture for Netflix is going to be something entirely different from a remarkable culture for Volkswagen or whatever. And I even had a book contract signed to write a book to prove this thesis that there is no one size fits all. And it's really hard to talk about remarkable culture that would be true for every organization. And as I dove into the data, I've interviewed hundreds of people in dozens of organizations over the years. And I dove into the data, and to my horror, I started noticing some emerging trends and patterns. And so basically that shattered my thesis for the book. And so what I noticed is that really remarkable cultures are unique and different, but they are built on a foundation of three pillars. And these pillars are fun, meaning, and belonging. And so I haven't seen a single organization in the ones that I looked at that people wouldn't report a sense of belongingness to the organization. And we can talk a little bit more about this. This sense of what I call deep fun. Again, we can talk about what exactly that means, and a sense of purpose in their work. So today my answer is remarkable culture is a culture that has these three pillars in place, and they're quite strong and stable, because I think it's a little bit like a three-legged stool. If one of these pillars is wobbly, your whole foundation for your culture is going to be wobbly as well. So yeah, that's the answer that I've arrived at recently.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, what I'd like to do is I love how you just talked about those three pillars, the fun, meaning, and belonging. And it goes back to what we kind of mentioned in the intro, is that there's that central core question to your work of, how can we infuse that into our work? So the fun, the meaning, and the belonging, being that those are those three key pillars. And ultimately, it's you even mentioned with the outcome of being able to put a dent in the world, which I think is pretty incredible. I think we could dive a little bit more deeply into those three pillars and just, kind of give us an overview of what does that actually look like when you start building on the idea of deep fun, finding meaning in work, and then also the belonging as well.
Yeah, I'd love to start with fun, because I think it's the most misunderstood and underutilized pillars of company cultures. And generally, when I start talking to people about fun, there's a lot of resistance. It's almost like, for a lot of people, fun and work don't really mix. So work it's this virtuous thing, and you need to be serious, and you need to take it seriously. And then fun is perceived as almost this frivolous thing, right, that we can hardly ever afford. So when I talk about fun, and what I've seen in my research is that we are definitely not talking here about the shallow fun of ping pong tables and Friday pizza parties. I'm talking about the joy of work itself. So it's not even the fun that take place at work, like, something enjoyable happens and it happens at work, so we have fun at work. I'm talking about the fun that people have with the work itself. And when I looked a little bit closer at what leads to this sense of fun, I discovered something that a science journalist, Catherine Price, discovered as well. And it was pretty amazing, because we basically arrived at a very similar conclusion through completely different paths. She was looking at a sense of fun in our personal lives. I was looking at a sense of fun at work. And through these completely independent paths, we've arrived at three elements that contribute to the sense of fun. So the first one is a feeling of flow. And I think we all know that flow is this deep focus. When we feel immersed in an activity, time passes. We don't even realize how fast it passes or what happened, because we're so deeply into what we're doing. The second element that we've noticed that people mention a lot, and the question that I asked people when I was interviewing them is just, please remember the last time you had fun at work. And actually, I think to illustrate that, I think it would be nice, I'm a podcaster myself, so I'm used to asking questions. So I think I'm going to put you on the spot, if you don't mind. And I would love to ask you, when was the last time you experienced fun at work? Please tell me a little bit more about this. And I don't mean the shallow fun. I mean the fun that is the joy of work itself. And if you can describe it to me, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so I can start. So I would say my deepest passion is around storytelling, and oftentimes that manifests itself through video. And so as a result, I would say that when I find myself having the most fun is when I'm creating scripting, doing all of the necessary pre-production work, production work, and then post-production for let's say a film with a very strong narrative. And that can be for work, or that can be for anything else, even outside of work. But that's when I find myself, you mentioned flow, finding that point of flow where I can just get lost in a problem, lost in trying to find the best way to tell a story. And it just consumes me, where I've lost track of time. I've lost track of just about everything. And I'm just deep into that work?
Yeah. So I hear flow here, and I also hear creative problem solving. And that's the second element of fun that I have identified in my work as well. So we refer to it as playfulness. And playfulness at work is basically when we get to be creative at work. And really, irrespective of whether I speak to people like you who do creative work, like filming or creating narratives and stories, or whether I speak to people who do work that we wouldn't necessarily consider creative, like accountants. They will speak about the same thing, which is just, solving wicked or difficult or interesting problems and having that sense of being creative while they're doing it. So it's incredible to hear that from you, because really almost every single story about fun at work includes that element of playfulness, of solving interesting problems. And what is it for you, Spencer? Do you have a story to share, like a specific time when you had a lot of fun at work?
Yeah, and I also have a question back to you around which of these do you think is the most important, or which one would you begin with as a priority out of flow, connection and play? Yeah. But yeah, the things that I think I get lost in is really around insights, gaining insights about my colleagues or my peers has been the best experiences that I've had, which often generate a lot of playfulness and definitely flow. But, giving you an example, asking someone very simply what, or colleagues or employees, what they would find as an unforgettable experience, just asking that question, and maybe even asking them to share some of their talents or their unique abilities, even funny things, you can then start to connect the dots between, we're trying to achieve X at this event or this training or this session, but this other person in the room has got some skills that we could match to that. And so magically you can kind of connect the dots. And we've had people up on stages at the start of meetings sharing their talents, their musical talents, singing, rapping, all sorts of things where you wouldn't have expected it. But because you ask those questions and you connect to the dots, it was just fun. And you seamlessly learn something.
So this speaks really to, I think, the most surprising element of fun for me, because I'm an introvert, and I was surprised to find that other introverts, including myself, will always mention others in their stories of fun at work. And I think what you've just mentioned, just, having an opportunity to connect to others in a meaningful way, it's deeply fulfilling. And so when people think about what constitutes those moments of fun, typically, even if you are very introverted, there will be other people in the picture. And I find this incredibly interesting. And I think it's an incredibly interesting problem to think about, especially these days during, in the era of remote and hybrid work, where we don't get as many opportunities to have these meaningful connections. And definitely we don't get that many opportunities to be in the same space together. And so I think it's a big challenge for all of us to think, how can we generate meaningful connections that will contribute to this sense of fun, whilst perhaps we're not in the same room. And I think storytelling is absolutely a wonderful avenue to get that to that space. You can do this virtually as well. And if there's anything that really resonates with people at a very, very deep level, I agree with you. I think these are those stories about what people are passionate about or where they come from, stories that really come from a deep place in people's psyche and connect to things that are truly meaningful for them.
Yeah. Just one follow-up question on that. Even for our listeners, what practical tips could you give them to, if they've written those words down, I want it to be free-flowing, have flow, connection, and playfulness. Where do they begin? Like, is there two or three simple, short things they can go away and do to figure out how to accomplish that in a meaningful way?
I appreciate this question because I think it's really important to make these things actionable. Because it's so nice to talk about them, but at the end of the day, if we want to create that environment, people need to know, people need to have an idea. What can I do? How can we implement those things? So thank you for creating the space for me to share a few ideas. So first, let's think about flow. If we want to experience a state of flow, what we cannot have are distractions. And the problem today is that, unfortunately, there are so many things that are pulling at our attention. So I think, the first really simple tip, if you really want to experience a state of flow or create an environment where your team members can experience more flow, it's really important to give it some breathing space. And that means that we cannot run from one meeting to another all the time. People need to have space on their calendars, ideally 1.5 hours at a minimum, to really work on an important task that is a priority for them so that they can do this creative work. Because if you have just slivers of time, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, yes, you will be able to make some progress, but it's very hard to get yourself into a state of flow. So time and space and lack of distractions are really important. So some of the companies that we work with, they have been experimenting with many different things, what they can do. Some use color coding on people's calendars so that people know whether they can disturb someone or not. So when you see, for example, red color, it means please do not disturb. I'm doing some deep work and I will not be available during this time. There are companies that have introduced, can I swear on your podcast?
Yep.
Okay. So they've introduced Get Shit Done days, and Get Shit Done day is basically a day where you cannot book a meeting at all. So the whole day is this, white canvas for people to work on the things that they need to see progress on and want to get themselves in a state of flow. So really eliminating distractions, I think, as a principle, as much as you can, is going to be super important. When it comes to the remaining two elements, so connections and then playfulness, there are a lot of things that I could share, but I'll go to playfulness and I'll say this. Generally, people don't believe that they are creative. And so playfulness, in the sense of coming up with creative ideas to problems that people face, requires a little bit of a change in mindset. And so I think, the first thing that we can do is really to acknowledge that we have been at some point in our lives a creative genius. George Land, I don't know if you're familiar with his work with NASA. When NASA was planning to put men on the moon, he created a creativity test, and he basically used this test to identify the most creative, the most innovative individuals who would help NASA to put the men on the moon. So the ultimate moonshot. As we know, it was a really successful test because they did put an amazing team together. And what George Land discovered when he started playing with this test in different contexts was that people are creative, but at a certain point in their lives. So he tested this test with 5-year-olds. And what he discovered is that 98% of 5-year-olds could be classified as creative geniuses. And we are not talking about kids from NASA's School for the Gifted. We're talking about kids with snotty noses and grubby knees, just like you and me used to be in the past. And so he was really fascinated, and he thought it would be good to turn this into a long-term experiment. And so he tested the same children, 1,600 kids, 5 years later. So now they are 10 years old, and he discovers only 30% of those kids are creative geniuses now. 15 years old, only 12% of these kids were creative geniuses. And finally, 30 years old, only 2% could be classified as creative geniuses. So I'm sharing this story with you because I think what's really important is that we first of all, reclaim our creative genius to be able to be playful and recognize the fact that we were probably one of those kids in the 98%. And what happened is through education and societal conditioning, et cetera, we lost it. But what George Land discovered is that non-creative behaviors are acquired and learned. And the good news is, if we can learn something, we can unlearn it. So my very practical tip to everyone, if you want to introduce more playfulness into the workplace, is help your team members and help yourself to reclaim that creative genius by doing exactly the things that 5-year-olds do typically. And again, I'm going to throw the ball into your court now and ask you, like, what do 5-year-olds do typically? Like, what do you see kids do when they grow up?
So I would imagine curiosity is huge. Like the idea of asking big questions is probably pretty key to that.
Totally. Like that can be annoying, right?
Asking the question why a lot, right? Five times in a row.
Exactly. So it can be almost annoying, but they ask a lot of questions, and especially the why, absolutely really curious. And also, and it's so wonderful to watch small kids, like they will take any constraint that they are presented with and just start creating solutions to basically entertain themselves, right? So you can say, you need to sit here in the corner of the room for 1 hour. And if you watch a kid at that age, they will come up with creative ideas of how to entertain themselves, even if they're just facing a wall. But one thing that those kids have also in common is that basically, because they don't have a lot of life experience, they do a new thing almost every day, and perhaps even multiple times per day. So like they have a first in their life multiple times per day. And there's research that shows that if we can do that as adults, this is going to rewire our brains. And so when I work with teams, I often encourage them to start doing that. So like literally, run a 7-day challenge or maybe even a 30-day challenge where you will do something that you've never done before, not necessarily work related even, because it doesn't really matter so much, but something that you've never done before. It can be cooking a new dish or even doing something slightly differently. So like if you are right-handed, brush your teeth with your left hand. That will work as well. There's research that shows that if we can continue this practice, our convergent thinking increases by 200 to 300%. And our convergent thinking, which is basically about identifying the good ideas and then implementing them, increases significantly as well. So my first practical tip is be playful about how you reclaim your creative genius and run challenges like that. A lot of teams that we work with have like a Slack channel with this 30-day challenge, and people will be sharing what they did. And it's incredibly engaging and fun. And people report that they really have seen an increase in creativity. So that's one thing. Second practical tip. And I see a lot of people implementing this, including Katerina Berry, who was one of the guests on my podcast, and she's the CHRO of Spotify. If you look at her LinkedIn profile, what you'll notice is a lot of pictures from various places around the globe when she does what she calls walk and talk. So basically, she'll take a member of her team, and instead of sitting in an office and having a meeting, they will actually walk. And again, research shows that walking increases our convergent thinking by 120% and convergent thinking by 23%. So it's really powerful. And it really helps to solve problems. And the definition of playfulness in the workplace that I use is solving interesting problems together. So that's very inducive to that.
Yeah, it's a great point, Josh. Children It made me think of loads of things, right? The importance of dancing when you haven't done it for years, the importance of talking to yourself, getting a big cardboard box and making something out of it that that you probably haven't done since you were 5 or 10 years old. All of those things just trigger something different in us. And I think if the more we can do that, the more we can have insights about colleagues' childhood memories or childhood kind of hobbies that they used to do. I think it would certainly refresh people's kind of feeling. Now, Josh, we have questions, I think, about your childhood. Should we go there next?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were in you grew up in Poland, I understand.
Yes.
And so we want to know a little bit more about your passion for culture. You asked that question on all of your podcasts, but where and how did you first find your passion for culture?
So this is really weird, but it's true. So I think the first moment I realized that I have a passion for culture, and I explain what I mean by that, was I think when I was probably 5 or 6 years old. I was growing up, as you've mentioned, in Poland. It was back in the days of communism, so behind the Iron Curtain. And that was quite constraining already. But on top of that, I was growing up in a house with older relatives, so my grandparents and an aunt, not with my parents. So I didn't really have a lot of friends, and it felt quite lonely. But what I did have access to were books, and I learned to read really early on because my aunt was a teacher. She was very passionate about teaching, so she actually taught me to read at the age of 5. And so I started reading, and I was also watching TV, and I loved all of these adventure documentaries and westerns also and stuff like that. And so what I would do, because I didn't have friends back then, was I would climb an apple tree in our garden, and I would sit perched on one of the branches and basically pretend that I was a pirate girl on a ship going on an adventure. And I would also imagine that there was a series of really cool people with me on that ship. And, because there are basically no limitations when you imagine things when you're a kid. So there was like a Native American and a shaman and other pirates and writers and really interesting people from all walks of life. But I think what they did have in common, it was that they were really different from the people that I was surrounded with in my little town. And that was something that I always craved, something different. I think it was because we were so isolated and our culture was so homogenous. Like back then in Poland, the only people you would meet were Polish people. They would have similar beliefs and similar culture. And so I was always, since I was a kid, I can remember I was always fascinated with different cultures, with the mystery, with things that I still couldn't understand. So that was my first, I think the first moment when I thought, oh, culture, people don't behave in a similar way. They don't wear similar clothes everywhere. They don't think in similar ways. And I was just so curious and so fascinated with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so understanding so you started finding that passion in understanding the things that maybe you didn't understand from other cultures as well. And then, so from that point on, like, what was the first experience that you had where you began to apply that in a real world situation, thinking about cultivating cultures, like your first real working experience in regards to workplace culture?
Oh my God, my first working experience. Yes. I'm laughing because, it was my first working experience was in a company that we co-created with a friend of mine. So we were really, really young, 20 plus. And I had this friend who was incredibly entrepreneurial. And at that time, I was still a student. I was studying English literature. And he tried to convince me to join his startup because he needed someone who spoke languages. And back then I spoke English and Russian. And so because he wanted to start exporting goods or doing business with other countries, so he would always try to convince me that I should join him in creating a company. And at some point I said, listen, I'm a huge fan of ice cream still to this day. And I said, okay, let's create an ice cream factory. At least, we'll get to eat a lot of ice cream. And it was a total joke. Like, obviously I wasn't serious, but he thought that it was actually a pretty cool idea. And so he started it. I wasn't there from the very beginning. And then I joined. So it was my first working experience. And as you can imagine, we really had no idea what we were doing, zero idea what we were doing. And somehow, through a combination, I think, of pure grit, persistence, and luck, that company was actually quite successful commercially. And so it started growing and growing, and our team grew. And very quickly, I realized that it was really hard to create an environment where people would feel happy and engaged, and where we would really be able to tap into what they were capable of doing. So I just looked at some people that I knew, and I knew that they were capable of more, but somehow there was something we were doing that didn't allow them to really, show all their talents and bring their full selves to work. So I went down this rabbit hole. I started reading a lot on the topic. I did some courses, and eventually I decided to do a postgraduate degree in strategic human resources management. I left that company because I wanted to learn more, and I joined a consultancy that was called HayGroup. Back then, it doesn't exist anymore. It was acquired by Korn Ferry, but it was one of the leading consultancies in the space of HR. And one of the people they were associated with was Dan Goleman, the father of emotional intelligence. So I think I would work for them even if they didn't pay me. I was so excited to join that company. And so that was my journey. And my drive was really to understand what were we doing wrong, and what are the things that you can do to set people up for success? Because it was such a stark difference how we performed commercially and financially as an organization and our culture back then. So I'm not proud of that, but we were really unable. We had zero knowledge, zero understanding, and we're unable to create an environment where people would genuinely feel like it's a great place to work and where they can do the best work of their careers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to kind of go back just for a second about the first experience that you had. I mean, it sounded like it had a lot of the elements that are required for the fun aspect of what you're talking about. First of all, ice cream, but then second of all, an interesting problem, and it required a lot of grit. And what it made me think of is, a good majority of our audience members are entrepreneurs, so they might have a relatively small size company, and thinking about that's like let's say a small pre-seed kind of funding company where maybe you're very limited in terms of the amount of employees that are working there. As you think about culture, it's an interesting question. Is that something that they can and should be actively thinking about, or is that just a natural byproduct of the idea of a close group of people solving a really interesting problem that they're all really passionate about?
Yeah. I work a lot with startups because I think that's my background, and so I'm interested in staying connected to the space. So I can actually answer this question with a lot of confidence, feeling that I am absolutely convinced that what I'm going to share is true. And the answer is yes, absolutely. You should be intentional about your culture from day one, simply because a startup that is a little bit like, scrambled eggs. If you scramble it, it's very difficult to unscramble it. So if you mess it up at the very beginning, it's going to be very difficult to unscramble your culture. And unfortunately, sometimes when you're so focused on results and solving interesting problems, but you are not intentional about your culture, it's easy to go to one of the extremes. And, cultivating a healthy culture is a balancing act. And basically, there are two primary tensions that we need to think about when we create a company and company culture. One is results versus relationships and people. So it's very easy to go to that extreme of results at the very beginning, at the beginning of the journey. And this is what definitely we did. And the result of that and the outcome of that is that you are at the risk of cultivating a culture that is going to be toxic, because basically at some point, you will value results more than people. If you go to the other extreme, and if you value people more than results, what you end up with is mediocrity. And clearly, as a startup, you don't want that either. So it's really how you strike that right balance. And that takes a huge amount of intentionality and a huge amount of work. It's like daily practice, really thinking, what can we do to strike that right balance? And then, of course, especially thinking of startups, typically startups will go, so the other tension, that was the first tension between results and people. And then you have the tension between rules and risks, right? So if you are leaning towards rules, what you end up with is bureaucracy. If you lean too much towards risk, what you end up with is anarchy. And I think, in a lot of startups, you end up in the situation where it can feel like, you have a lot of anarchy happening. Yeah. And it's great for the first handful of people who started the company. But the moment you start hiring, the moment you start scaling up, you'll see people coming into your organization, and the first question that they're going to ask you is like, where's the employee handbook? Or what is our strategy, right? And these are the questions that very often founders are not prepared to ask, because they are just used to always, coming up with solutions and ideas on a whim and without really thinking things through, or maybe just through a continuous iteration. But that might not be enough when your team is growing. So, that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Oh, that was perfect.
Very short answer is absolutely yes. I think being intentional about culture from day one is incredibly, incredibly important.
Yeah, I love that. I just have one follow-up question, if that's okay. And then Spencer, I'll toss it over to you. But, one thing that I'm really fascinated about is when you talk about culture, you're very specific about using the word cultivate, like cultivating culture, as opposed to maybe others might talk about it in terms of transforming culture, changing culture, designing culture. And cultivate is a very specific word that means something to me very, very different, much more careful, much more in a way that you much more recognize that there is something of value to be grown out of this thing. I wonder if you can talk about why the specificity and using the word cultivate when you talk about culture is so important to you.
First of all, thank you for noticing that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And to your question, yes, indeed, it's intentional. And the way I see it is, when you cultivate something, or when you think about cultivating a plant or something that is alive, which culture actually is, there's this whole process of really tending to it almost every single day, if not every single day, sometimes multiple times per day. And to me, this is the only way you can actually have an impact on culture. So it's never one and done. And also, you cannot mandate it. It has to be a movement. There has to be a group of people who do this, the right things every single day. So one part of Cultivate is that daily practice and daily habits that maintain the right kind of culture or help it evolve in the right way. The second aspect, and why I'm not a huge fan of the word design a culture, is that you already have a culture. So it's not like you can design it from scratch. I mean, even if there are only two people in the company, like the two co-founders, the moment you have two human beings interacting with each other, you have developed a culture. Families and relationships, even romantic relationships, have a culture. And so saying that we want to design it, well, yes, you could do it, but definitely you cannot design it from scratch. So I prefer cultivate because, first of all, it's something organic. It's something that's already there and you want to respect it. So like you want to respect what's great about what's already there. And that's an important process for me, acknowledging that certain things are working really well, and then identifying, what needs to happen, what wants to happen, and how can you help it to grow in the right direction. Whereas the design is more of I would say it makes us think about designing something from scratch. It makes us think about culture as as an object rather than something organic. And I think culture is more of a living organism than an object, for sure, 100%.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I love that answer. It's something that we've been thinking about a lot. Yeah, go ahead, Spencer.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce Icy's name, but Icy Bursell that you interviewed around design was interesting, wasn't it? Because I say, yeah. So she can, she talked about deconstructing and reconstructing, well, anything to do with in design, but I think it also applied to culture. Could you take it? Yes, you can't start a game, but you could understand it in a way that you've maybe not understood it before. Let's deconstruct the whole thing, reconstruct it, and actually find the areas that you can make the most difference when it comes to cultivating culture. But yeah, I thought those was great points. What is the biggest challenge you face then in cultivating culture and showing, well, specifically showing its value that you did cultivate it?
I'm thinking of specific situations where I was either the person within an organization trying to be intentional about cultivating culture, or working with organizations as a consultancy. And the most challenging situation when it comes to cultivating culture. So one of the challenges that I faced, and it was so hard that I eventually decided to leave that space, was working for and with large consultancies that work with really large organizations that are bound by certain regulations to do something about their culture. So, for example, in Europe, especially in financial institutions, they need to be able to prove that they have taken measures and actions to cultivate a certain type of culture, for example, risk culture. And so as a result of that, you end up as a consultancy working with a lot of clients who simply see it as a compliance issue rather than anything else. And so it's a tick a box exercise where you do certain things, you say, okay, I've done it and we're good, but nothing really changes. So the need for doing this work is there, but it's not for the right reasons. And I found that incredibly challenging because, of course, if there is no real intention to change something, and if you are just going through the motions to be able to say, yes, we are investing in our culture, it's a very frustrating experience. So I would say that was the most challenging thing for me as a consultant, having to go through the motions with these clients who are really not genuinely committed to doing the work. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to step out of it and create a situation for myself and the company that I'm building right now, CultureBrained, where we can actually work with organizations that are really serious about this work and perhaps say no sometimes, to client organizations that are not serious about the work. Because I'm driven by impact. I want to see, some ripples of our work, and I want us to see that we have contributed to positive change. And when that's not possible because of various reasons, it can be incredibly difficult. So I would say that was the biggest challenge for me personally, to be in a situation where you feel like it's really, really hard to see that impact.
Yeah, and finding the right organizations that are ready for change to get to the next level. Is super, super important that you just said. What is your most proud kind of work that you've done that has made not necessarily the biggest difference, but the one that comes to your mind now that's the most proud moment where you helped make a difference to cultivating culture?
I think it might be a little bit of a recency effect, because I've done some work with a couple of organizations recently, and I've had people reach out to me and say, thank you for this. There's this concept that we use, and an idea and differentiation between being an advocate of something and an activist. And so we say, be an activist, not an advocate, because an activist is someone who takes daily action to cultivate the right kind of culture. And an advocate is someone who consistently talks about the need for change, but it doesn't necessarily translate into action. And so I've had people reach out and tell me about what they did to be an activist in their team and very specific actions that they have taken. And I have to say that I am always incredibly moved when I see individuals within organizations who are not necessarily even at high ranks in these organizations to move from aspirations to maybe contribute to something, to actually doing things and feeling empowered and getting the space to take action. So that always resonates with me at a very, very deep level. And if I know the people, if I've met them, that is super powerful for me. So I would say that's the most recent, really powerful thing that sticks with me. Hearing from people, I've done this, I've done that. It was really great to feel like I can make a difference, and it's important and it counts. Because at the end of the day, I think this is how we cultivate thriving cultures, one person at a time, but it does require a movement. It cannot be a mandate. So when we can mobilize people in organizations this way, where someone who doesn't even have a title, team leader or a manager, takes responsibility for their culture in their team, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, the area of how to create a movement, a cultural movement, is super fascinating. And you might have different views as a kind of as a consultant, kind of coming in to help an organization. But when you're in an organization, I'm kind of curious to know, this is the question, Josh, around kind of leadership. Is it the leaders or is it the people on the ground can make the biggest difference to cultural change? And you're just talking about, in fact, it's Seth Godin's book on linchpin. I feel very passionate about, like, you can make an inordinate difference as one individual. You really can, if you choose to. And you can create these kind of grassroots movements inside big organizations or maybe even small organizations. But which is the most important, the leader, the people on the ground? Where would you begin to really change, create a movement of cultural change?
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of both end thinking. And so I wouldn't necessarily frame it as an either or proposition, because of course, ideally you want both. So you want leadership to create the right conditions for people to be able to engage with this work, be the people who go first and role model certain things, but also people who, because they have decision-making power, some systemic changes cannot really be achieved by a movement. A very simple example, like if we want to create a better reward system that rewards the right behaviors, unfortunately, typically, it cannot be done by people in the accounting department. You need a buy-in from a decision maker in your organization. So I think leaders are incredibly important, of course, to this work. And we see this in the diagnostic tools that we use with organizations. So over the years, I've always worked for companies that were very data oriented. And so we've always used tools to take a snapshot of culture at various moments in time. And, what's really interesting is that you'll see a change of a CEO and immediately, like a month later, culture is completely different. So we've seen organizations that have made incredible progress towards a thriving culture over the years. And then leadership changed and they went backwards, literally 10 years, literally. So we looked at there because this was a long-term project and we've been with this organization for 10 years, doing the diagnostic every single year. After a few months, this organization went back 10 years. So clearly, we cannot say that leadership is not important. It's incredibly important. But at the same time, you cannot mandate a certain culture. And I think, for people who work in a department very far removed from senior leaders, what shapes them and the way they think and the way they work is the person who sits next to them or the person that they collaborate with most frequently and how they engage with them. And so we work a lot with what we call informal influencers within the organizations or informal leaders. And these are typically people who have very high social capital. They are very well connected within their organization. These are the people who others trust, respect, value for their expertise, and feel connected to. And these people are incredibly important in cultivating a healthy culture. So I think it's both. You cannot really, if you want to be successful in cultivating a healthy culture, you cannot, I think, be successful without both of these approaches, bottom up, but also top down, obviously, in some cases. And leaders can make or break an organization. We know this. We've seen so many examples now that a CEO can literally destroy a company culture in just a few months.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think that's really interesting. And you mentioned actually, so in that, the idea of a culture snapshot, like you take culture snapshots and you're very data oriented. What does that mean, a culture snapshot? And what data are you capturing to be able to quantify and measure culture, I guess? Yeah. That's a great question. Of course, there are so many different tools out there that people can use. Right now, we've developed our own approach in CultureBrained, but I did use third-party tools for many, many years. So there's definitely a lot that people can look at and decide to use. So what we look at is the tensions that I've mentioned earlier. So we like to plot, to help our clients plot where they are on this people versus results and risks versus rules. And we put two different lenses there. So we will look at the senior leadership team and where they are and where is the rest of the organizations, because very often you will have a significant gap there. And these gaps and the way they are integrated, they play a huge part in what, culture sins you will see there, whether there's going to be bureaucracy or whether there's going to be mediocrity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing that we look at. We also look at, we map the organizations against these three pillars of thriving cultures that I've mentioned. So fun, meaning, and belonging. We have specific behaviors associated with each of these pillars. Again, typically we will split, of course,
and you can slice and dice the data any way you want. So based on departments or levels of hierarchy, other demographics as well. And the third element that I think is really, really important is helping an organization to have an honest look at how they live their current corporate values or any other elements of what we refer to as their culture playbook. So in our methodology, a culture playbook will typically have 5 elements. I'm not going to go into that, but basically that is the blueprint of your desired culture. That is what you put on a poster, right? But as we know, very often what you have on a poster versus what is actually happening in an organization doesn't necessarily align. So I think it's important to take that snapshot and see, what do we say we do, or what do we say we value? And what do we really do? And look at these gaps and identify what are the areas that really need some work. So to do a really good culture diagnosis, I feel like we need all these 3 elements so that we know what's going on. And that gives us the data that we need to identify what we call really a high leverage intervention. And a high leverage intervention is an intervention where you do something that requires relatively low effort with high impact. Because we try to be as pragmatic as possible. We do know that people in the organizations we work with are incredibly busy. Culture is important for them, but at the same time, they have so much on their plate. Resources are scarce typically, and I'm talking about people as well and their time as well. And so we need to help these organizations to identify what they can do specifically that is going to have major positive impact on their culture and relatively fast. That's usually the request. Like, how can we move the needle in the right direction relatively fast? And when you have some data that you can rely on, it's so much easier to do it, honestly, because unfortunately we think that we know what our culture is. I mean, over and over and over again, every single time we run a culture diagnostic, some areas, yes, companies do know the issues that they have and what's going on, but there are so many blind spots as well. Especially senior leaders are so much more optimistic, I would say, when it comes to their culture. Like they think, oh yeah, our culture is really quite good. But when you look at the point of view of the rest of the organization, they don't always agree.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's amazing. I'm conscious of time, but I do want to just ask, could you give us an example of one of these, if that's okay, give us an example of an intervention that was a high impact, kind of low effort and was able to really make a difference?
Yeah. So just thinking of the literally the latest project that we've worked on with a client. So we've identified a suite of various issues and challenges that they've had with their culture. But when we looked at the root cause of all of these issues, we basically landed on psychological safety and growth mindset. Like these were the 2 issues that stood in the way of all the other issues that they had. And so what we decided to help them with was identify a good approach to increase psychological safety first, and then cultivate growth mindset. So starting with psychological safety, we looked at leadership behaviors, because clearly people who are in positions of formal power are the ones that typically take away from a sense of psychological safety. So we looked at that. We started with building awareness around what it is and how you build psychological safety in the first place, because it all starts with awareness. And it's incredible how little we know about what it is and how it shows up. And clearly it's not enough. So it's not enough to know what psychological safety is, but when we talk about it, and I love Tim Clark's approach with the 4 levels of psychological safety, people will really go like, oh my gosh, I haven't even thought about it this way. Like, for example, the first level accepting people for their individuality and the sort of things that you need to do to really demonstrate that it's okay to be you, full stop. So there's a lot of obviously awareness building that you need to do. You need to create a language and help the client also to create a language when people are doing things that go against this. So one of the things that I've learned and we're incorporating in our work right now from Kim Scott is, for example, flagging issues. Like she literally will use a purple flag when they notice bias, right? And someone in a meeting, when someone says something stupid that basically goes against psychological safety, they will raise the flag. So we help our clients to create these rituals and the language and the common language where it's okay to talk about these things and it's okay to flag issues so that with time that they can create a psychologically safe environment. And so that, when you think about the potential impact of a psychologically safe environment on innovation, on learning, on growth, on results, it's huge. We haven't, in this specific organization, we haven't been able to measure it yet, but we will. And so we'll see what the impact really is. But typically, we identify KPIs, we identify the things that the organization wants to change, and then we try to correlate the interventions that we've been implementing with how the results are doing to see whether they have a positive impact. And there is an iterative process there that I think people use and teams use, especially product teams use a lot when they try to land on what's the right product. And we use a similar approach to iterate, to land on the right kind of initiative and the right kind of approach so that it produces the right results.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'll toss it over to Spencer. I'm sure, Spencer, you've probably got a question.
Oh, no, I was going to say, we're going to introduce something we've not done before, which is a rapid fire, inspired, of course, by you as well. But before we do that, and I know we've got just under 10 minutes left, do you have anything else, Josh? Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say we're going to transition at some point.
Yeah, I think I have, I'm interested in that last point, actually, but I do have one more question. But I guess the methodology that you're using, let me just say, from an iterative, this is not the question, unfortunately. I'll get to it. But the iterative methodology, are you referencing like agile or something like design thinking, where you're introducing an element of discovery and the various phases of what it might be to innovate, design, things like that. But I'm interested in that.
Yeah. So we use a hybrid and a mix of methodologies that basically enable us to pilot an initiative in a small group for a short period of time.
Okay.
And see whether it's having a desired impact. So we identify at the start what would be the indicators of this being successful. And if we don't see desired impact, we go back, we typically work with a group of people that we call a culture squad. And a culture squad, typically with the organizations we work with, consists of these informal influencers that I talked about earlier. And they are with us from the very beginning of the project. And they are the ones responsible for coming up with solutions to, if this approach hasn't really landed the way we wanted, what would be a different way? How could we iterate so that it has the desired impact based on the feedback that they get from users? So I really like, and I am fascinated with how teams designed products, and I'm learning a lot from product design and trying to implement it as much as I can to how we design those people oriented interventions or culture oriented interventions, because at the end of the day, they are supposed to serve the users, the final users. And so we create that feedback loop to see, is that having the desired impact? If not, why not? What might be standing in the way? And going back to the drawing board, iterating, rolling it out again, really short loops at really short periods of time. So not huge experiments, and then testing it again and again until we land on something that we feel like we can roll out in the large organization.
Yeah, I love that.
We're talking our language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I can only imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's actually one of our previous guests, Nate Walkingshaw, was the chief product officer at a company called Pluralsight, had started many companies as well before, and is now building is currently in the process of building a company called Taurus, but he has a methodology called directed discovery, which is a very human-centric process, and a lot of like half discovery, half development. It's very interesting. I'm not going to do it justice talking about it, but I would definitely recommend checking it out. It's a great methodology and process. Yeah, for sure. I know we want to go to the rapid fire, but I would feel horrible if I didn't ask this question. So, understanding the moment that we've gone through across the globe, thinking about some of these major external influences that are impacting company cultures. So of course, COVID, moving towards virtual environment, then companies not sure, well, do I go back to virtual, or do I stay virtual, go back to work? Do I stay hybrid? And then in addition to that, we're seeing things like quiet quitting, and then overemployment, where employees are also working multiple jobs while pretending to be just working one job. Mm-hmm. And I'm just interested in, with the companies that you're currently working with, what are some of the things that they are doing, the successful ones, or the ones that are cultivating remarkable cultures? What are they doing in response to some of these major influences that I can imagine might do something to a company culture?
Yeah. So we work a lot with companies that are globally distributed. I think it was a natural evolution for them to move towards remote first environment or hybrid environment, but because they are globally distributed, so remote is always important for them, has been important for them, and now even more. And so what I see them do, the really great companies and the successful companies, is to really rethink a few things. So like, how do we create meaningful connections in this environment? What can we do to prevent overload and burnout? Because I think one of the side effects of this whole situation has been that there's research that shows that meetings, for example, have increased by, I don't know, some crazy number. I don't remember. I think it was 300% or something like that. So basically people are now constantly in meetings, and then after the day is over, they need to do their actual work. Yeah. So of course that leads to overload and burnout. So companies that are approaching it, I think, really successfully, they are very, very intentional about figuring out, what do we need to do differently to still be able to maintain these meaningful connections without duplicating what they had been doing in the past and just adjusting it to the virtual environment. I think that's incredibly important because, I hear companies say, oh yeah, we have our virtual parties or social events where people have drinks and happy hours or whatever. But we all know that it's not really great to be a part of these events, and it doesn't really create meaningful connections. And so you need to start thinking about these things differently. So a couple of examples. They'll, for example, say, okay, what are the facts? The facts are people still need in-person interactions, but now we don't work in the same office. So how can we create meaningful in-person interactions that will help people build that social capital and social connections? And so they'll do, for example, what I love that some of the companies we work with do is they'll do co-working weeks where they will go for a week in one location, and 5 hours of the day are just working in the same space together. But 3 hours of the day are really designed for people to meet others, people that maybe they haven't met before, team building, getting to know each other, just hanging out together and, eating meals together and stuff like that. I think it's very effective. I've seen it work really, really well. It's certainly feasible because if you don't need to maintain your offices, your large offices, you have the resources, you have the budget to do this from time to time. So I really like that, being super intentional about designing these days. So it's almost like, you design a conference, and I see them approach this very, very intentionally, very professionally. Another thing that I've seen that companies do really well when it comes to meaningful human connections is facilitating those almost chance, interactions with colleagues that you wouldn't have normally met by, Donut, or there are other apps that basically will pair people up for a virtual coffee. Where the purpose is just to meet someone from a different department that you've never worked before. And that's the thing called bridging, because what we've seen during the pandemic is that teams that work together got even closer together. But there is now a really large distance between the parts of the organization that wouldn't typically work together. So that's just one example of what I see organizations do really well. Another thing that I see great organizations do really well, is rethinking the way they manage performance and rethinking the way they manage rewards. I think particularly when it comes to rewards, it's so important to think broader than we used to, and making sure, first of all, that we reward people for the right things, and also in a way that people will appreciate. So I love, for example, what we see in our CultureBrained community. There's one company, I'm not sure if they would be comfortable with me sharing this, so I'll just skip the name, but they use blockchain technology and a token system to cultivate a deliberately developmental culture, where people basically are encouraged to identify a problem, identify a solution to the problem, say that they want to lead that project. It has to be something that is going to push them out of their comfort zone, but it's also going to force them to collaborate with colleagues that they wouldn't collaborate normally. But it's on a real issue that the company is facing. And the senior leadership team then comes together and they discuss, how much is it worth for us? Like, if this team, pulls it off, like, what would be the value for us? And they capture this value in the tokens. So they have these X points. And so they say, yeah, this is worth 1,500 X points. And so when the team is done, and if they're successful, but even if they're not successful, so people get rewarded for taking initiative and putting this team together, they will get these points, the X points, and then they can decide how they are going to use them. So you can put them in your provident fund, your retirement plan. You can buy a ticket and go somewhere on a trip. You can pick some other experiences that they have. So I really love this innovative approach to reward that is driving collaboration, that is driving meaningful relationships, that is driving the sense of deep fun where people have the autonomy to solve problems. And, I have so many other examples. We're lucky, as I've mentioned, to run this community of culture leaders from really incredible companies around the globe. And we hear so many great ideas about how to approach this new world differently, because I think what worked in the past, we all know, is not going to work now. So it does require us to think out of the box.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love all those examples, especially the last one. It resonates with some conversations that Spencer and I have even been having recently. So Spencer, do you want to? Yeah,
are we okay for time? Or are we okay for time, Aga?
Yes, let's go for it.
Okay. All right. That's great. Yeah, but I loved your comments. We could probably have a podcast just about that. Tell us 10 of your favorite, rituals or examples from other companies, and kind of dive into each one of them and have a conversation about them. Let's do that sometime. And I also believe that, like, the community that we have inside companies, great things are already happening. Find them, identify them, invest in them, right? Do they have to recreate something? There's probably someone already doing some type of reward recognition program as an experiment somewhere in a silo. Find it and then blow it up. And I think that, you've talked about experimentation, the importance of that.
Yes.
Okay.
I love that. I love bright spots.
Yeah.
Love bright spots, finding bright spots and learning from them. I love it. Yes. We're fully aligned here.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think there's often leaders fail because they think, oh, why are these people doing this thing in silo? Why don't they stay in their swim lane? But actually, if they're making an impact and they're being playful and they're being, it's just working, then blow it up. And when I say blow it up, and invest in it, make it something massive in the company, give them the role to do that. But anyhow, so this rapid fire, I might fail on this rapid fire, but really short answers. You know that. Let's start with a really easy one. Let's see, based on what you've learned from your nearly 100 episodes, right? Which guest had the greatest impact on your life or business?
Seth Godin, hands down. Seth Godin. He's been such a great teacher to me. I mean, I've learned so much from him. I've participated in a number of his workshops. I met two incredible women. I met a lot of people through Seth Godin, but two incredible women with whom we still meet every second Thursday now. But for the first few years, we were meeting every Thursday at the same time. One of them from Boston, the other one from Australia, and just talking about our businesses and how we grow them. So there is so much that I am grateful for to Seth Godin. He's been an incredible mentor to me. So definitely, hands down, Seth Godin is the answer.
Yeah. No, that's great. Do you know what? Originally, I put other than Seth Godin because I knew you were going to say Seth. But it's okay. It's okay. We'll move on. So let's see. Most impactful book that you've read this year?
Idea Flow. So Idea Flow is a book written by two authors. I'm terrible with names, so we will put it in the show notes because my memory is terrible. It's a book written by two people who are involved with D-School, which is one of the most famous schools and courses on design in Stanford. And basically they talk about how to create a strong innovation pipeline. And I'm reading it now actually and learning from it and implementing it as I go, literally. And I'm loving it. And I see the impact of it after reading the first 3 chapters, which is very rare. Like a lot of books are quite repetitive and the stuff that they share is nice to know and good to know, but you think, what are the takeaways and what can I implement? And somehow you don't have a clear answer. That one, amazing. 3 chapters in and I've already seen the impact.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Okay. Here's a fun one. Have you done your elliptic exercises today?
What? How do you know that? How do you know that I have the elliptical? Actually, I wish I could turn the camera on, but I can't. But it's actually right in front of me. No, I haven't yet, but I will do after this interview.
Yeah, because I was going to say, why not? But yeah, okay. Well, for those listeners, including me, who don't really understand fully about what those types of exercises are, we're going to Google it afterwards. Okay, next one. This is a tricky one to do very quickly, but your biggest unanswered culture question that you have, like something you still are trying to figure out, the biggest thing, like what is it? You can pass, by the way.
Yeah. My biggest unanswered culture question. Well, I would say it's kind of an ongoing question that maybe I've figured some things out, but definitely there's so much more, is how do you accelerate? How do you accelerate culture, cultivating culture in a scale-up organization? A lot of companies that we support are very successful businesses that grow really, really fast. And so really one of the biggest challenges is how can we make sure that we embed our culture, the great stuff about us at scale really fast. And so there are some answers, but definitely not enough. I think that the world needs more answers to this question.
All right, nice one. So
can I ask one real quick?
Yeah.
If there was one person you would want on your podcast that you haven't already viewed, who would that be?
Ooh. Only one, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a hint there, isn't there?
I don't know. Is there?
I don't know. It might be related.
No.
It might be I thought it might have been a relation, but because if you don't say that one, you might not get it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, it's already. Let me please give me a second. I want to have a think of.
Yeah, for sure.
Just one person, and like that would be guaranteed that they would really come onto the show.
I'll ask Spencer real quick while you're thinking about that. Spencer, if there was one person we could have on our podcast that we haven't had on yet, who would it be? Yeah, for sure.
Oh gosh. No, you got me. I would say
Right? It's hard to decide. Like there's so many people.
Yeah.
Yes. Someone like Peter Drucker, or like some real, or Clayton Christensen, someone that's,
Oh, so it's dead as well,
really
not
deep
only
thinker.
alive. So we're even widening the pool now.
Well, I was going to say, Aga, if you don't say, Josh, you're not going to want me to say this, but if you're not going to say my brother, you might have missed the opportunity.
Totally. Yeah.
Because he's like, he's number 50, on them.
Actually, but seriously though, right? I would definitely love to have Greg on the show because his work is so incredibly relevant to what I believe is incredibly important, especially in scale-up cultures, which is essentialism. We see so many successful organizations try to do too much and fail because of that. It's hard, and when the market is great and when they're successful, you suddenly see 25 priorities. And so people get overwhelmed and spread too thin. So yes, totally. Thank you for that. That was a really great help. And I would definitely love to have Greg on the show.
You want to give him a message, a shout out?
Yes.
You want to invite him right now, live?
Yes. Will you put a word in for me?
I'll give it a go.
Greg, I would really love to have you on my show, The Culture Lab. I think that you are the best person to speak to a lot of our listeners who struggle with identifying what they need to focus on to make their business successful. They spread themselves and their people too thin. And so we really want to pick your brain and talk about essentialism with you. And definitely it would be also pretty awesome to be able to speak about you in your book.
Very good. Okay, last few. Most embarrassing situation or biggest fail you've had. It could be anything, nothing to do with culture, but something, maybe work related. I don't know. But anyway, you choose.
Yeah. Well,
I've got a list. I've got some insights here as well. By the way, I could give you some suggestions. Yeah.
Okay. Well. One thing, it's actually quite serious. And I think I want to share this one because it sheds some light on something that is super important. I don't think that we spend enough time on this, at least not me. I've just realized. So I was doing a keynote and a workshop for a client recently. And it was the keynote was about culture. The workshop was about reclaiming our creative genius. And we had an exercise where basically participants needed to stand up and form a circle at the back of the room. And because I wanted people to do this really fast, so I said, okay, and on the count of 3, stand up and run to the back of the room and form a perfect circle. And then we will do the exercise. And I didn't think about it, and I didn't realize that we had one person who had mobility issues. And so they were not able to go there fast. And when I realized, when it was already too late, because basically everyone was at the back of the room and this person was there, unable to move to the back of the room, I was mortified. And I realized, and from now on, the learning for me was, you absolutely need to ask before other people with any special needs or any issues that we need to keep in mind when we design these things. And that made me think about how little I know about this issue and how we can really be inclusive in the workplace with everyone. And so I definitely want to bring this topic to my podcast as well. Like, what do we need to do to be inclusive to people who have limitations or issues that some people don't. And how can we be really mindful of that? It was really mortifying for me and also heartbreaking, and I felt terrible. So yeah, that's an example of a really embarrassing situation. Not really funny, but truly mortifying.
If I can say one thing, like I can empathize with that. It's really interesting. I mean, just recently, a colleague and I were facilitating a design thinking session virtually. Mm-hmm. So this idea where you have a lot of vulnerable collaboration and taking place on these virtual tools, like some people might use like basically a digital whiteboarding tool. And what was interesting is we had a participant who doesn't use keyboard or mouse or has difficulty using keyboard and mouse. Mm-hmm. And for virtual collaboration, all of the online tools basically require keyboard and mouse. And it required us, like, it's an interesting situation that wasn't available with any of the online tools that we could find. There was not a single tool that would accommodate, let's say, a voice to text application in which they can also collaborate and participate with their team in an effective and engaging way. So we had to really think about how to do that in a different method. But it's such a difficult thing to put to just take yourself out of your own shoes and imagine those experiences of others and kind of building in that time and space when you're thinking about those experiences and those things that you'll be creating is just who is beyond the idea of this mythical average person that's going to be participating in this experience. And I think that's a really great thing to prompt yourself.
And
with.
Josh,
I
really love the way you phrased it. Actually, I think I'm going to use it in one of my questions now to my clients, like, asking them exactly that, like, who is not our mythical average person that we need to be thinking of when we design this for you? This is a really, really important question. For some reason, we haven't been asking it to our clients. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we are pretty much out of time, and we couldn't get to the European Patent Office experience.
Oh my gosh. What do you know?
I was just reading online, all about your, or lessons from your dad. Like, I would have loved to know. I hear that your dad is pretty incredible at coaching sports, basketball and football. But yeah, we've run out of time. So I think maybe we get an opportunity for you to share, wrap up, maybe any suggestions of who we should interview. That's a lesson from you, asking you who in your circle of influence and people who we should really talk to next. But yeah, mention, comment on any of those things in your wrap up.
Especially, how can people reach out and get involved with, your company, CultureBrained, and how they can find you as well, or your podcast?
Yeah. So I'm happy to send you recommendations of great guests for your show. So that we can do this offline, and I promise I'll do that. When it comes to where people can find us and find our community and CultureBrained, I think one of the best places to go to is to our website and my website, which is agabajer.com, which is spelled AGABAJER.com. Our community CultureBrained can be found at CultureBrained.com, and it's a community for people who look for new ways of cultivating thriving cultures, and where they can find incredible peers on the same journey and learn from each other. And the CultureLab podcast is available everywhere, wherever you listen to your podcast. I would love, by the way, to do a culture swap. So I would definitely love to have you on the CultureLab. So we need to arrange that.
Yeah, that would be
Sounds
fantastic.
amazing.
Thank you so much for your time. We've gone over. We appreciate all the work you're doing, and it's just been really, really fun.